Sophie Thomas had always been a voice of change, a young influencer who quickly rose to prominence in the social media world for her unapologetic stance on social justice. She had always been an ardent advocate for equality and diversity, using her platform to highlight the issues that others either overlooked or shied away from. At just 26 years old, Sophie had already built a following of millions across various social media platforms, Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube, where her messages of inclusion resonated with people from all walks of life. Her content ranged from eye-opening documentaries about racial inequality, to heartfelt posts about the need for better representation in entertainment, fashion, and business. Sophie wasn't just another influencer sharing lifestyle tips or beauty tutorials. She was using her voice to ignite important conversations around privilege, race, and social change. Sophie's rise to fame was nothing short of meteoric. She started as a small-time blogger, posting about her own experiences with inequality and how her own privilege as a well-educated, middle-class woman had shaped her views on the world. Her raw and relatable writing connected with readers who appreciated her candor and passion. What set her apart from many others in the digital space was her ability to speak to both the oppressed and the privileged, challenging them to look at themselves and their roles in perpetuating societal issues. She wasn't afraid to confront difficult truths, often calling out industries that perpetuated stereotypes or excluded marginalized groups. As her voice grew louder, so did her following. She went from being an unknown advocate to the go-to influencer for everything related to diversity and racial equality. Her social media channels flourished with praise. Celebrities, activists, and even corporations began acknowledging Sophie's efforts, sharing her content, and publicly lauding her for her commitment to pushing the needle on diversity. It was clear to anyone who followed her that Sophie wasn't just an influencer in the traditional sense, she had become a role model. People began to look up to her not just for her beauty or her trendy wardrobe but for her integrity. Sophie used her ever-growing platform to hold others accountable, frequently calling for media companies, fashion brands, and even governments to make real, tangible changes in how they approach diversity and inclusion. She was seen as a beacon of hope, someone who had the courage to speak the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it made people. Media outlets often featured her as an expert on racial equality, and she was frequently invited to speak on podcasts, at conferences, and even at universities. Sophie's image was that of someone who was at the forefront of a social revolution, someone fighting for the rights of the oppressed, advocating for those whose voices had often been silenced. Her following believed in her message, they believed in Sophie. She had successfully crafted an image of a fearless advocate, a modern-day activist for the Instagram age, and the world adored her for it. Sophie Thomas's voice echoed across the digital landscape when she posted a passionate video on her platform, calling for greater diversity and inclusion in media, politics, and corporate sectors. In the video, Sophie spoke with a raw intensity that captivated her audience, urging those in positions of power to take a long, hard look at the lack of representation that still plagues society. She outlined how the media continued to favor certain demographics, how corporate boardrooms were still overwhelmingly white and male, and how policies and politics often ignored the voices of marginalized communities. Her words were sharp, measured, and filled with an undeniable sense of urgency. She called for companies to make room for more voices, to promote diversity not as a trend, but as a core principle that could no longer be ignored. The video ended with a bold statement: if we want real change, we need to create space for the people who have been shut out for too long. And that starts now. It was a rallying cry for those who had felt unheard for years, and for many, Sophie's words were a lifeline. The response to her video was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours, the video had garnered millions of views, and Sophie's message was shared across every major social media platform. Celebrities, influencers, and activists all jumped in to show their support, amplifying her call for diversity. Major companies reached out to Sophie, offering her collaborations, while politicians praised her for her insight and dedication to dismantling institutional barriers. Influencers who had previously remained silent on the issue of diversity now echoed her message, posting about the importance of inclusivity and fairness. The hashtag #CreateSpaceForAll trended for days, becoming a symbol of solidarity for the marginalized voices Sophie had advocated for. Her supporters praised her for being a beacon of hope in a time when so many felt that change was impossible. It seemed as though Sophie had done the impossible. Her words had not only resonated with her followers, but had sparked a movement that transcended social media and started infiltrating the mainstream. She had become the face of a new generation of activists, celebrated for her unwavering commitment to creating a world that truly embraced diversity. Behind the scenes, however, there was a quiet undercurrent of doubt that Sophie remained blissfully unaware of. Some of the more seasoned voices in the activist community began to question whether Sophie's actions were as genuine as she presented them. They whispered about her rapid rise to fame, about how her content often seemed more about personal branding than real systemic change. There were murmurs that Sophie's work with corporate sponsors, many of whom had long been criticized for their lack of diversity, seemed at odds with the values she preached. Critics began to point out the growing number of deals Sophie was making with brands that had long been known to exclude people of color or who had only recently jumped on the diversity bandwagon to capitalize on the growing trend. Some activists, those who had spent years fighting for diversity in more marginalized spaces, began to ask, was Sophie truly committed to dismantling the systems she spoke out against, or was she simply using her platform to boost her personal brand? Sophie's authenticity, so firmly embraced by her millions of followers, was now being quietly questioned by those who had been in the fight long before her. But Sophie, ever confident in the support she had from her followers, remained blissfully unaware of the growing controversy brewing just beneath the surface. She continued to ride the wave of praise, focusing on her collaborations with celebrities and brands, and basking in the recognition of her hard work. She had become a symbol, a poster child for diversity in a world that was still learning how to embrace it. Little did she know, the very success she had worked so hard to achieve was slowly setting the stage for a reckoning that would soon change everything. It was a quiet afternoon when the storm began. A social media user, digging through old posts on the internet, uncovered a series of photos from Sophie Thomas's past, photos that Sophie had long since deleted. The images were taken during her college days, and in them, Sophie appeared in blackface, a deeply racist and offensive act that many considered a glaring reminder of her ignorance and privilege. The photos were innocuous enough at first glance, but as they were circulated online, the implications were impossible to ignore. The user who discovered them immediately posted the images along with a scathing caption, "Look at this so-called diversity advocate, her past tells a different story." Within hours, the post went viral. The photos quickly spread across social media like wildfire, leaving a trail of disbelief in their wake. Sophie's followers were stunned. For years, she had positioned herself as a fierce advocate for marginalized communities, especially people of color, and here she was, caught in an act that many saw as one of the most damaging displays of racism. Sophie's reaction was swift, but it was one of disbelief and deflection. She immediately dismissed the resurfaced photos as an attempt to tarnish her reputation, claiming they were taken in her younger years when she had no understanding of the consequences of her actions. Sophie posted an impassioned message on Instagram, trying to distance herself from the photos. "I made mistakes when I was young," she wrote, "and I am deeply sorry for the ignorance I showed in those moments. But I have grown. I have learned. This is an attempt to discredit the work I do now. Don't let the past define me." She framed the discovery of these photos as an attempt to silence her voice in the fight for diversity and equality. She spoke with conviction, urging her followers not to judge her on one mistake from her past. But despite her attempt to control the narrative, the damage had already been done. Sophie's apology didn't land the way she had hoped. Many of her followers, especially those from the very communities she claimed to represent, began to question her integrity. The photos were not simply a relic of a past life but a glaring contradiction to the values Sophie preached daily. How could someone who had once donned blackface truly stand at the forefront of the fight for racial equality? Her critics began to multiply, some accusing her of hypocrisy, while others argued that her apology was nothing more than a carefully crafted attempt to save face. The backlash grew louder as more people shared the photos and began to scrutinize Sophie's past. People dug deeper, questioning the authenticity of her activism. Sophie's social media pages, once filled with praise and admiration, now became the battleground for debates about her past and whether she was truly a champion for diversity. Her once adoring fans began to waver, their belief in her shattered by the resurfacing of her old photos. The hashtags she had once been celebrated for now became a battleground for those calling her out on her past actions. Yet Sophie, still clinging to the notion that the photos were nothing but an attempt to sabotage her, refused to back down. She couldn't fathom that her image, carefully crafted over the years, was crumbling in front of her eyes. The photos continued to spread, and Sophie's career began to shift from one of celebration to one of scrutiny. Every post she made was now viewed through a critical lens. Her followers who had once supported her unconditionally now began to ask, how could she stand for diversity when she had been part of something so harmful? It was a question Sophie would have to confront, whether she was ready for it or not. Sophie's response to the viral exposé was immediate but fraught with defensiveness. In a heartfelt yet impassioned video posted across all her platforms, she addressed the Blackface photos head-on, calling them a bad mistake from her past, a moment of youthful ignorance that she deeply regretted. She explained that the photos were taken during a time in her life when she didn't fully understand the weight of her actions, framing them as a reflection of a younger, less educated version of herself. Sophie pleaded with her followers to recognize her growth, highlighting the work she had done since then to educate herself on racism, inequality, and privilege. "I have learned so much since then," she said, her voice quivering. "The person I am today is not the same person I was back then. I don't want my past to define me, but I will take full responsibility for the mistakes I made. I am sorry, and I am committed to doing better." But Sophie's apology didn't have the effect she had hoped for. Instead of reassuring her followers, the video seemed to deepen the rift. While some expressed understanding, many were unimpressed by her attempt to brush off her past with an explanation that felt too convenient. They pointed out that the photos were not just a mistake but a reflection of her lack of awareness about the harm her actions could cause. Her dismissive language about youthful ignorance didn't sit well with those who had seen her rise to fame as a self-proclaimed champion for diversity. Was this really the same Sophie Thomas who had dedicated herself to dismantling systemic racism? If so, how could she have been so blind to the racism of her past actions? The fallout from Sophie's denial was swift and severe. A growing number of her followers began to question whether her apology was genuine or just a calculated attempt to salvage her career. Calls for accountability escalated, and the online conversations turned from sympathy to outrage. People demanded that Sophie take more concrete steps to show she was truly remorseful. An apology alone wasn't enough. They argued that a genuine commitment to change would require action, not just words. It wasn't long before major brands that had once partnered with Sophie began to distance themselves. Sponsors who had previously praised her for her work in advocating for diversity now found themselves in a precarious position. One by one, these brands issued statements expressing their concerns about Sophie's past actions, some even going so far as to end their collaborations. What had once been a profitable partnership now became a public relations nightmare. Companies that had associated themselves with Sophie, proud to be linked with her brand of activism, now had to weigh the risk of continued affiliation. Sophie had built her platform by pushing for inclusivity, but now, her past actions stood in direct opposition to the very principles she had championed. Sponsors, fearful of being linked to controversy, began to reconsider their ties. The fallout extended beyond just her online community. Businesses, media outlets, and even her peers started questioning whether Sophie could be trusted to continue her role as a spokesperson for diversity. In the span of a few days, Sophie's once pristine image began to crack. The backlash spread from social media platforms to mainstream media, where commentators, journalists, and even other influencers began to weigh in. The question was no longer whether Sophie had made a mistake, it was whether she was truly committed to making amends, or if her apology was merely a form of damage control. Sophie's world, once filled with admiration and praise, now felt suffocating. As the criticism mounted, it became increasingly clear that her previous efforts to build a brand around social justice were now under intense scrutiny. The dream of being seen as a beacon of change was beginning to feel more like a distant fantasy, and Sophie was left to navigate the harsh reality of being publicly held accountable for actions that, in her mind, she had already moved past. The emotional toll on Sophie was immediate and devastating. What had once been a bright and promising career now felt like it was slipping through her fingers, And with every passing moment, the weight of her past mistakes pressed down on her more heavily. She had always prided herself on being an advocate for justice, someone who stood at the forefront of the fight for equality, but now, she was painfully aware of the hypocrisy in her past actions. The blackface photos, once a distant memory, had resurfaced to haunt her, and Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that everything she had worked for was now at risk of unraveling. She had spent years building a platform, using her voice to fight for the very communities she had harmed. The backlash felt overwhelming. Every apology, every attempt at defense, seemed to make matters worse. Sophie found herself questioning whether she had truly earned the trust of the people who had once seen her as an ally, or whether her activism had always been a performance, a way to build her brand rather than a genuine commitment to change. Late one night, Sophie sat in her apartment, staring blankly at her phone. The messages of criticism and the media headlines blurred together. She didn't know how to escape it or how to fix what she had broken. It was as if the very foundation of her identity was cracking, and she didn't know how to rebuild it. Sophie had never imagined that the mistake from her past could come back so forcefully to challenge everything she stood for. She had been so focused on advocating for change that she hadn't taken the time to reflect on her own actions, to truly understand the full scope of her privilege and the damage her past ignorance could cause. Sophie realized, with a deep sense of regret, that she had failed to fully confront her own biases and the systems of power that allowed her to make such a mistake in the first place. The days following the exposure were filled with sleepless nights and quiet reflection. Sophie began to reach out to those closest to her, her family and friends, seeking solace and perspective. One evening, she called her older brother, Marcus, whom she had always turned to for guidance. As the phone rang, Sophie's stomach twisted in knots. When he finally answered, his voice was warm but cautious, knowing what had transpired. "Sophie," he began gently, "I know you're hurting, but you have to understand that growth isn't just about saying sorry. It's about looking at what led you to that point and really understanding why it happened." Sophie listened, her eyes welling up with tears. "I thought I was doing the right thing," she confessed, "but I never stopped to think about my own privilege. I never thought about the harm I could cause. How could I have been so blind?" The conversation marked the beginning of a long period of self-reflection. Sophie began to ask herself hard questions about why she had failed to learn earlier. Was it because she had surrounded herself with people who looked like her and shared her worldview, never truly confronting the perspectives of those she claimed to advocate for? Had she been so focused on the recognition and success that came with being an activist that she overlooked the importance of truly understanding the struggles she was fighting against? Sophie's reflection took her deeper into her past, into the moments when she had dismissed issues of race as someone else's problem, or when she had been ignorant to the privilege that had shielded her from the harsh realities others faced. She realized that her activism had often been performative, a way to gain approval rather than to challenge herself to grow. In the quiet of her apartment, Sophie grappled with the uncomfortable truth that her past was a direct reflection of the very systems she had spent so much of her life fighting against. The photos, now burned into the digital archives, served as a painful reminder of how far she still had to go in her journey of learning and unlearning. As much as she wanted to dismiss them, Sophie knew they would always be a part of her story. Yet, for the first time, she understood that her growth wasn't going to come from denying her past but from facing it head-on, learning from it, and ensuring that she would never make the same mistake again. This was her moment of reckoning, and though it hurt, it was also the beginning of something far deeper than the image she had once projected to the world. As the controversy surrounding Sophie's past continued to unfold, the calls for accountability grew louder and more insistent. It wasn't enough for Sophie to offer a simple apology, not when her actions contradicted everything she had preached for so long. Many members of the public, especially fellow influencers and activists, began to demand more than just words. They wanted concrete actions to back up her claims of growth and remorse. They were no longer satisfied with the vague promises of self-reflection and personal growth that Sophie had made in her initial video. Instead, they were calling for genuine change, urging Sophie to use her platform not just to apologize but to actively contribute to the very causes she had so often spoken about. Donations to racial justice organizations, involvement in anti-racist work, and public commitments to dismantling the systems of privilege that had allowed her to make such a damaging mistake. These were the steps Sophie would need to take to prove her commitment to change. The demands were clear. Sophie's past was no longer something she could simply dismiss. She had to show the world that she was willing to take responsibility, not just for the mistake, but for the broader system of inequality that had enabled it. The pressure on Sophie intensified as these calls grew louder. Her once loyal followers, who had supported her in her rise to fame, now seemed to view her apology with skepticism. They felt that the apology alone was not enough to atone for her past actions, which many saw as a glaring contradiction to her advocacy for racial justice. Sophie began to feel the weight of the expectations placed on her. She realized that, no matter how much she wanted to move on from her past, it was impossible to erase it. Her reputation, once built on the belief that she was a champion of diversity and inclusion, now stood in stark contrast to the hurtful images from her past. Sophie had always believed that her work, her messages, and her platform were enough to make her a credible voice in the fight for racial equality. But now, she saw how easily a single misstep could unravel years of progress. People wanted more than just an apology. They wanted to see her put her money where her mouth was, so to speak. They wanted to see her step up in meaningful ways, to not just talk about racism but to act on it, to use her position of influence to advocate for change in ways that were authentic and impactful. This realization hit Sophie hard. She had always prided herself on being someone who used her platform to promote good, to call out injustice, and to challenge the status quo. But now, it felt as though the very values she had fought for were slipping through her fingers. Sophie had come to understand, in a way she had never truly grasped before, that words alone would never be enough to change the world. If she wanted to prove her commitment to diversity, she would have to act sincerely and consistently, and not just in the short term but as part of a long-term commitment to anti-racist work. The truth was uncomfortable. Sophie couldn't simply apologize and move on. She had to prove, with actions, that she was ready to take responsibility for her past and to work toward dismantling the very systems of oppression she had spent years fighting against. The pressure to prove herself was immense, but Sophie knew that it was necessary. If she wanted to regain the trust of her followers and continue her work in a meaningful way, she would have to show, through tangible action, that she was worthy of the position she had once claimed as a leader in the fight for diversity and inclusion. The battle to rebuild her credibility had only just begun, and the road ahead would require far more than words. It would demand real, lasting change. Sophie's path toward redemption began when she publicly acknowledged the depth of her past mistakes in a way that felt both honest and vulnerable. In a new video, she admitted that no matter how hard she tried, she could never fully redeem herself for the harm her past actions had caused. She confessed that the blackface photos weren't just a youthful mistake but a reflection of her ignorance and privilege, something she would have to live with for the rest of her life. Sophie's words were raw, a stark departure from the defensive stance she had previously taken. "I cannot undo the past," she said, her voice filled with humility. "But I can commit to learning and growing. I can promise you that I will never stop trying to do better." She made it clear that her journey wasn't about regaining lost followers or salvaging her career. It was about truly taking responsibility and making a real, lasting impact on the world. Sophie promised to use her platform to educate herself and others, to understand the intricacies of racism, privilege, and allyship on a much deeper level. She pledged to donate a portion of her earnings to organizations that focused on racial justice, to support marginalized communities in tangible ways, and to dedicate herself to the long-term work of undoing the harm her past actions had caused. Sophie knew that this was only the beginning, and that her redemption would require more than just words. It would require consistent, deliberate action. As Sophie began to follow through on her promises, her journey toward genuine change began to unfold. She started by speaking at events about privilege, allyship, and the importance of understanding one's own role in perpetuating systems of oppression. Sophie didn't just talk about the issues, she openly shared her own story, speaking candidly about how her upbringing and background had shielded her from fully understanding the struggles that others faced. She confessed how her previous activism had sometimes been more about gaining social capital than affecting real change, and how she had failed to acknowledge her own role in upholding the systems she had once claimed to fight against. Her willingness to admit her flaws in front of an audience resonated with many, and for the first time in her public career, Sophie felt as though her words were truly aligned with her actions. Sophie also began to collaborate with communities she had once overlooked, recognizing the importance of amplifying voices from those who had been silenced for too long. She worked alongside activists from communities of color, listening to their stories, learning from their experiences, and supporting their efforts in ways that went beyond just writing a check. Sophie started volunteering her time, attending grassroots events, and using her platform to elevate the work of those on the front lines of social justice. It wasn't enough for her to simply donate to a cause. Sophie needed to be present, to truly understand the struggles she had once been blind to, and to actively contribute to the movements that were already in progress. Through these collaborations, Sophie began to see the complexity of the work that still lay ahead. She realized that fighting for diversity and inclusion wasn't a one-time campaign or a set of hashtags. It was a lifelong commitment to challenging her own biases, amplifying voices that had long been marginalized, and working to dismantle systems of power that kept inequality in place. Sophie's transformation was far from perfect. There were moments when the weight of her past mistakes felt overwhelming, and there were still those who remained skeptical of her intentions. But Sophie was undeterred. She understood that redemption wasn't a destination, it was a process. She had started on a new path, one that was rooted in genuine accountability, and she was determined to continue the work, no matter how long it took. Through her efforts, Sophie began to rebuild the trust of many who had once seen her as a symbol of change. But for Sophie, the real victory wasn't about winning back followers or repairing her reputation. It was about becoming the person she had always claimed to be, someone who was truly committed to making the world a better place, not for herself, but for everyone. Sophie's journey toward redemption was met with a mixture of reactions from the public, a reflection of the deep divide that had formed in the wake of the controversy. Some believed that Sophie's efforts to change were genuine and that her willingness to confront her past and take responsibility for her mistakes showed a level of maturity and self-awareness that could lead to real, lasting transformation. They applauded her for using her platform to educate herself, her followers, and the broader public on the complex issues of privilege and allyship. These supporters saw Sophie as a work in progress, someone who had learned from her mistakes and was now dedicated to doing the hard, unglamorous work of making amends. For them, the apology and subsequent actions were enough to restore some faith in her commitment to racial justice. On the other hand, there were many who remained deeply skeptical. For them, Sophie's past would always cast a long shadow over her efforts to atone. They questioned the sincerity of her motivations, arguing that her sudden shift from influencer to activist was too convenient, too aligned with the rising trend of corporations and celebrities embracing diversity and inclusion for profit. These critics pointed out that Sophie's past actions, specifically the blackface photos, weren't just mistakes, they were a reflection of a deeply ingrained ignorance that she couldn't easily erase, no matter how many donations she made or events she attended. To them, Sophie's apology had come too late, and the damage to her credibility was irreparable. They questioned whether someone who had been so oblivious to the implications of their own privilege could truly become an ally for the communities they had once harmed. As the debate continued, Sophie found herself in a difficult and uncertain position. While some cheered her on as she worked to rebuild her credibility, others kept a watchful eye, ready to call her out at the first sign of hypocrisy or misstep. Sophie knew that it would be a long and difficult road ahead. She had seen the power of public opinion, the way it could be both a force for good and a weapon for destruction. She knew that she would never be able to fully erase the stigma of her past, but she was determined to continue on the path of growth. Sophie understood that her redemption wasn't just about changing public perception, it was about proving, day after day, that her commitment to diversity was more than a fleeting trend or a performative act. It was a lifelong process, one that required humility, hard work, and an unwavering commitment to the values she had once espoused. The story of Sophie Thomas ends on a note of uncertainty. While she has made strides toward redemption, her future remains unclear. Will her past continue to overshadow her efforts, or will she be able to prove that true change is possible, even for those who have made serious mistakes? The question lingers in the air, unresolved. For Sophie, the journey has only just begun, and the outcome will depend not on public approval but on the authenticity of her actions and her willingness to face the consequences of her past. The path forward is fraught with challenges, and the true test of Sophie's redemption will be whether she can sustain the momentum for change long after the headlines fade. Ultimately, Sophie's story is a reminder that redemption is not guaranteed and that the weight of our past actions often follows us, even as we strive for a better future.